Welcome back, Steve. It's always nice to talk with you, so I'm glad to have another conversation again today. We've spoken about GDPR on a few occasions now. However, as we approach the May 25th deadline, which is only a few days away now, I think many organizations would benefit from a state of play, getting guidance from a trusted, independent source who specializes in information risk management. After all, there really isn't much time left for organizations to get ready for this coming regulation. GDPR will not go away, organizations can't avoid it, and individuals can no longer bury their heads in the sand and say that they will get to it eventually. So, Steve, for organizations faced with the following scenario, they thought things were moving along nicely, but following a meeting with the team managing GDPR implementation, they're concerned that they're not going to meet their deadline. The obvious questions are, is it too late for them, and are they going to be fined if they aren't fully compliant right on May 25th?
It's a good question to start with, Tavia, because certainly there are a very large number of organisations in that category at the moment. I think that I saw some research just the other day that said that only about 8% of the small to mid-sized enterprises in the UK were actually ready for GDPR. So a big number that aren't. I think the important thing to remember about GDPR is that it doesn't all come to a halt on the 25th of May. That's the start of the race, if you could look at it that way. And so, yes, of course, organisations need to be in some form ready for that race. But if they aren't completely compliant by that date, it isn't the end of the world. What the different information commissioners are looking for across Europe in all of this is a plan, a process, something that organisations can point to that demonstrate that they've understood the obligations under GDPR, that they are well on the way towards implementing some of those, and indeed that they have really ticked off some of the more important elements of it. So I'm thinking here about things like, subject access requests. I'm thinking about protecting the most sensitive elements of information that exist across an organisation. And so for organisations that perhaps aren't 100% in shape for the start of the race on the 25th of May, as I say, it really isn't, the end of the world. What they have to do, however, is get themselves in a decent condition. Because, of course, the challenge with all of this is you never actually know when you're going to suffer a breach or you're going to lose data. And that really, for me, I think, is the challenge with GDPR, because you have to be in a state of compliance, if I could put it that way, from the 25th of May onwards. Are people going to be fined if they're not fully compliant? Well, that depends very much, of course, on what happens. So if you do lose a significant amount of personal information, then, of course, there's going to be some form of fine. There is a view that the different information commissioners are going to be looking for a particularly big fish to land at the outset so that they can make the point. My own view on this is that I think that if you are unfortunate enough to lose personal information and you cannot demonstrate that you had made every reasonable effort over the last 2 years to get your business in shape, then yes, of course, you're going to be faced with a significant fine. But I don't think that ICOs, generally are going to be going out of their way to impose punitive fines at the outset. I think what they're going to be doing is really trying to feel their way themselves in terms of what this might look like. So really, if you're not in shape, what you have to do is get a gap analysis done, understand the key areas that you need to be focusing on, tick those off as quickly as possible. You're probably going to have to incur cost to do that. You're probably going to have to get some external support. If you've left it, to this point, as you made the point you made earlier, that there isn't that much time left. So you are going to have to incur some cost. But certainly the gap analysis for me is probably the most important piece there, to at least get you to that starting line, and then you can progress from there.
So it's clear that organizations need to be ready to provide answers should legislators come knocking at their door or a customer submit a data subject access request. Can you tell me what are the 5 key actions that organizations should do right now to demonstrate that they're working towards GDPR compliance?
Yeah, of course. I think the first thing is pragmatism in all of this. You need to stop at the moment take a look at where you're at. I talked about a gap analysis just now. It is about understanding your current state and what you want to achieve. So that's the first thing. Accept the fact, I think, that if you do have gaps, that you cannot achieve full compliance before the 25th of May, and that's okay. But you will need to have set out some priority tasks that you must achieve by then and that you can achieve within that time frame. So review where you're at, generally accept that you're not going to be fully compliant, and focus on some of the key priority tasks. Those would be the top 3 for me. And I think then once you've assessed all of that, what you can do is move on to complete the outstanding tasks. So that would be the 4th point. And then the 5th is from 25th of May onwards, really set yourself a project plan that is going to make sure that you are watertight going forward. And that will change. So again, the thing about GDPR is it's not a project that just ends on the 25th of May. And I've heard that from some people. Some people have talked about winding down their GDPR teams because, 25th of May, that's it, we're all done. Actually, it isn't. That's when the fun really starts. And it is important, I think, to have this ongoing review process across the business that ensures that you're compliant going forward.
Interesting. So in your estimation, it's been made pretty clear that enforcement is going to be fairly aggressive.
I think that, again, it comes down to the individual legislature. If you look at the UK as an example, then the view from the ICO is that organisations have had 2 years. Mm-hmm. How much longer do you want? Mm-hmm. You've had 2 years to get ready for this. And so there is an expectation that you're going to be able to demonstrate that you've put in place at least some of the core requirements. But we're going to have to wait and see. I mean, that's the thing about this. We never actually know how the legislators and regulators are going to move until they begin to do so. We have the guidance from the ICOs. We have the requirements across GDPR. And we, of course, then have the interpretation of the various organisations that are involved in that. But until the starting gun actually goes, I think really it's all conjecture.
Let's shift the conversation a bit to Facebook, which has been so widely in the news and everyone is up in arms about it. There's currently a Facebook inquiry on data privacy, and we now know that 50 million Facebook profiles have been inappropriately harvested, and the information used highlights the need for organizations to have a better hold on how they and their third-party suppliers are using, managing, and protecting their customer data. I understand that the issue with Facebook is more about an inappropriate use of information, and it's not about a data breach. But that inappropriate use of information or allowance of the information to be used still makes them vulnerable to economic sanctions. We're not sure if or what amount of money Facebook might be fined, but the phrase, "this could happen to us," must be playing heavily on the minds of many organizations right now. And the fact that Mark Zuckerberg has had to answer in front of a public inquiry should serve as a heads up to all business leaders that ultimately they will be held accountable for data breaches, and they cannot allow themselves to take a hands-off approach on how data is managed in their organizations. So with this understanding that there's a line between breaches and inappropriate allowance of data being used, what do you think, Steve, would have happened had all this come out about Facebook after the 25th of May, or if all of this had happened within the Facebook realm after the GDPR deadline?
Well, I think that there are two things going on here, and they happen to have come together at the same time. So we've got the run-up to GDPR, where people are obviously very concerned about how their organisations can demonstrate that they're being compliant with the essence of the regulation. And then we have, of course, this instance with Facebook and with Cambridge Analytica. And so we've got the two things that are coming together that, for me, actually are serving a very useful purpose. What they're doing is they're fairly and squarely placing the right to use personal data on the agenda. And I think that for a lot of people, the GDPR was probably something that was happening in the background. But actually GDPR, if it required, an example of why it should come into law across the European Union and indeed beyond that, then Facebook has provided that for me. You rightly point out that there was no breach involved. Facebook actually was doing what it has done for a number of years. We have to understand the Facebook model. The Facebook model is to sell information. It gathers information. It provides that to advertisers. There are a certain amount of guidelines and controls that users have. But here's the interesting thing. Those were put in place at a time for very many people who signed up for Facebook when privacy and personal data wasn't such a hot topic.
Mm-hmm.
Things have changed. The views that we have today now around the use of personal data have significantly changed. And so I think Facebook, if it's done anything wrong, has just failed to keep up with that and has failed to change its business model to reflect what has become much more of a societal norm and interest in how you happen to be using my information, and indeed what you can do with personal information and how you might influence certain outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
The GDPR is all about how you protect the right of the individual and how the individual is in control of his or her information. And organizations like Facebook, like Google, like Amazon, and a number of others have to reflect that in the controls that they then provide to the individual user. So had this happened post 25th of May, I'm sure that various ICOs around the world would have been looking very keenly at it to see whether or not there was any breach of the GDPR. The reality is that they're doing that anyway, because it is, as I say, such a large example of how personal information can be used, perhaps without the knowing acceptance of individuals. And I think that, one of the lessons coming from it for a lot of organizations who really want to stay on the right side of all of this is that they will have to be asking regularly their users if they can use certain elements of personal data. And from my own standpoint, I see nothing wrong with that. I'm very much in favor of regular requests as to how my information might be used, whether I'm using apps, whether I'm actually online, or whatever it is that I happen to be doing. And I think that's one of the shifts that we're seeing. And I think that Facebook will have to reflect that. I think Google will have to reflect that. I think the other point that you make is around responsibility. If you happen to be the chief executive or sitting around the boardroom in any organization that is making use of personal information, then you have a responsibility. Mm-hmm. And that is a very significant change again. It isn't going to be good enough going forward to claim that you didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And for organizations that have extensive use of personal information, that is going to present a challenge because we're going to have to see some changes in terms of accountability and the way in which chief executives and the C-suite in particular are made aware of some of these, some of the sorts of things that have been coming out through the various hearings in the United States that involved Zuckerberg around what Facebook has or hasn't been up to. And I think that that's where the ICOs will be taking a slightly different view. That they will not be as tolerant of the fact that I didn't know or I'll have to get back to you. Because actually, if you're running an organization that is handling personal information, that's not good enough. You have to know. You have to be confident that you have the right processes in place, that you can defend those from a reasonableness standpoint. And, I run a large organization and it's impossible for me to know all of things. It really isn't going to be a defense going forward.
Right. Are we Facebook friends yet?
I don't use Facebook.
I sort of assumed you didn't.
I have an account, but
I know
don't
that
use it.
I'm the first person you'll friend when you get back into that platform. Steve, if I was an organization working with several cloud service providers and third parties who all have access to my customers' data, give me some advice. This is an area we've tended to overlook while focusing on internal procedures. So how does GDPR affect the third parties and customer contracts? And again, can you share, if you will, 2 or 3 actions that an organization should take to check, ensure, and help their third-party suppliers to manage my customers' data in line with our GDPR requirements, putting myself in that organization mindset?
Yeah, this is a horrible one. And if you look at any organization, it doesn't matter about the size of organization now. Every organization, I've said this many times before, is interconnected with a whole variety of other enterprises around the world. And the whole essence of commerce today is that we share significant amounts of information. Well, under GDPR, of course, you need to know where that information is, how it is being stored, how it's being managed, and the levels of security that are around it. For very many organizations, that is a big challenge. You cannot, however, move away from your responsibility as the controller of the information. So if I take your information into my enterprise, Tavia, then I'm the controller of that information. Mm-hmm. I may pass it on to a third party for them to process, but that doesn't mean that I hand off the responsibility for securing that data. So that processor that I've handed it off to may in turn hand it off to another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. And therein lies the real challenge with all of this. So what is it that you can actually do? I think that, first of all, you need to map out the information flows across the organization. Now, if you happen to have put in place already a data protection officer, a DPO, then perhaps this is something that his or her team could get involved in. You will probably, if you're a large enough enterprise, have a third-party vendor management organization that, again, has some kind of view as to the contracts that have been let and where information is being shared. It becomes a little bit more difficult when we get into the cloud, when we begin to look at individuals' use of data and what individuals are actually doing with it. But again, I think if you can rationalize the number of third parties that you're using, rationalize the amount of information that is being placed with them by individuals, then that is a good first step. I think education is absolutely key. You know, one of the biggest challenges for me with the GDPR is that the enterprise isn't necessarily in control of the way in which personal information is being gathered. So I might go to a conference, I might meet a number of people, I might take their personal information. I may capture that on my personal smartphone. And I may then put that into, a CRM system, maybe it's Salesforce or whatever it might be. But I might forget to do that. And so it might be sitting there. Now, all of these things suddenly take on a level of importance from the enterprise standpoint. So enterprises have to also look at how they can work with individuals. And for me, those individuals should be classed as third parties. So traditionally, when we think about third parties, it's these big, processing giants that we might be using, or it's somebody that we're sharing information with. For me, it also includes the end user who could be gathering this information and using it. And so there's a big education program that really needs to take place across the organization that starts with employees and goes right the way through to every single person that is touching personal information along the way. I think that the focus for a lot of organizations at the moment has been about implementing adequate data controls with supporting documentation that they can point to and guidelines. The next stage for me, however, is to go out then and actually perform some proactive education and some audit of how successful is this being. Security for a very long time has not been that effective in making sure that individuals understand some of the governance requirements, the policies, the processes that are out there. And I think that's one of the challenges that everybody faces in this particular space. When it comes back to the larger third parties or indeed cloud service providers that you mentioned, again, it is about having them understand the requirements that you have. And the good news is if they're handling personal information for you, they're probably doing it for a number of other people as well. So you would expect that they will have some form of process, but ask to see it. Look at how it compares with what you would expect. And so a lot of this is really just about doing some due diligence, really, so that you can highlight areas for attention and that you can then continue to reinforce some of the messages and some of the processes that are required for your organization in order to maintain the satisfactory level of GDPR compliance going forward.
This has all been really helpful, as all of our conversations are. You're always a wealth of information. And I now have a better understanding of where organizations should be focusing their efforts. So here's the million-dollar question that I know everyone wants the answer to. Where can organizations go to get help with this immediately, especially as they're coming up to this imperative deadline Are there any straightforward implementation guides and processes that an organization can use, and how will they know what sources can be trusted?
Yeah, I think, it was always to be expected that as we got closer and closer to the deadline date, we would see very much more activity on the marketing side from IT vendors, software providers, professional services organizations about what they can do to help you. And I'm not knocking that. That's absolutely fine. I do think, however, that it has to start with the organization. So I've talked quite a lot today about the need to do this gap analysis to really understand, where you are in relation to the GDPR. The ISF has been talking about GDPR probably for about the last 18 months to 2 years. We've made a lot of noise about it. We've produced a number of different guides for our members, the latest of which is the ISF's implementation guide for GDPR. What that does is it walks you through the process. So that really is the starting point, I think, for some organizations. Understand the process. And there are other organizations out there that have got similar. But for me, obviously, the ISF's implementation guide is probably the one that you should refer to. And members can access that through ISF Live. If you're not a member, then again, you can hop onto our website and we can help you out with that. Once you've understood the process, you then have to move to the second phase, which is about this gap analysis. And again, it really, at this stage, is going to require some external support. Mm-hmm. You can get that from any number of professional services organizations. Again, from the ISF members' standpoint, ISF Consultancy Services can help you do that. We've been very active with a number of our members, both large and small, around the world in helping them to determine some of these gaps and implement processes to close them. So I think that, again, my advice would be find some form of process-based guide. If you're a member, then the ISF implementation guide is there for you to use free of charge. Engage, secondly, with people who understand what they're doing in this place to help you bridge that gap and to really come away with a solid project plan that you can implement over a period of time. And again, if you're an ISF member listening to this and you've got any concerns at all, then do get in touch and we'd be very happy to help you out.
Mm. Or look on the ISF's Facebook page.
We don't have a Facebook page.
Steve, let's reiterate just once more. Once the initial implementation has been done, compliance costs and activities may decrease, and organizations may also see more general benefits for their businesses and increased customer confidence with this increased focus on data privacy by design. Well, Steve, thank you so much. You are the Managing Director of the Information Security Forum, which is comprised of over 450 global organizations who are facing this May 25th deadline and the need for GDPR compliance. It's clear that you have worked to provide some clarity in this space and to develop a guide and processes that can be used as the basis for achieving GDPR implementation. And in fact, I understand that the ISF recently won a prestigious award for its GDPR work. Congratulations. Business leaders need to support the teams that are managing the delivery of GDPR implementation, and they need to appreciate that this is not a one-off activity. They will have to build into the DNA of their business GDPR implementation, as they will be held accountable should a breach occur. To view the ISF's implementation guide for GDPR and to get an idea of the support the ISF can provide for GDPR, please visit securityforum.org.